Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second panel. Thank you for being here today. My name is Anya Singh, and I'm a member of CU UNICEF. This panel is going to be discussing the protection of refugee children through policy. We will start with the discussion with our panelists for the first 30 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A session with our audience. It has been estimated that typically half of any refugee population are children. It is essential to realize that refugee children are children first and foremost. And as children, they have specific needs that must be looked after and fundamental rights that must be upheld. To that end, legal protection of children's interests is essential as it legitimizes each child's right to dignity and resources. On this panel today, we're honored to have four extremely accomplished individuals who have deep expertise in this field. First, we have Dr. Louis Zayas, the Dean of the Stephen Hicks School of Social Work and the Robert Lee Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. He's presently president of the Society for Social Work and Research, the world's largest social work research organization. We have Rhonda Fleischer, who is a program specialist in migration at UNICEF. She leads UNICEF's global positioning and technical expertise on the protection of migrant and refugee children arriving in the US along the Central America-Mexico migratory route. Our third panelist is Dr. Susan Martin. She's the Donald G. Herzberg Professor Emerita of International Migration. She founded the Institute for the Study of International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I thank you all for being here with us today. Like the previous panel, each question will first be directed to a specific panelist, after which it will be open to all other panelists. I would like to request you all to limit your answers to 2 to 3 minutes if possible. So my first question is for Dr. Zayas. To what extent does the exploitation of children take place in refugee detention centers in the United States? What shortcomings in the US response have led to this trend if it exists?
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this important event and to be part of a panel with some distinguished people. Also on a historic moment, as we've all know, we've elected a new president in the United States. Let me begin with the idea of exploitation. My work has been largely in US immigration detention centers in South Texas. And with respect to exploitation, it's hard to tell what level of exploitation there is. When it has emerged, typically it's been the exploitation of adults, mostly women, with guards and others perhaps asking for favors and intimidating women into submission. But with respect to children, it's hard to tell at this point what the exploitation is. We do know that the children have been exploited previously, and when they come up into our hands, into our care, whether it's through the Office of Refugee Resettlement or ICE, we do act to take care of them. However, the idea of exploitation will take some time for us to see. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that insightful response, Dr. Zayas. Would anyone else like to add to that? Okay, so my next question.
Sorry, this is Susan Martin. I would just add to what was just said, which I agree with, is that in some ways detention is itself exploitative. And in the sense, not so much of how we think about trafficking being exploitative of the child's labor, sexual trafficking, but in terms of the conditions themselves in detention, of the problems in terms, or the threats to the well-being of the child that are due to the mental health issues that come up, the lack of education, appropriate education, lack of recreation. All of these things have a very deleterious effect of the child, even if they're not being directly exploited for labor or sex or other purposes. So just to sort of get that on the table as well.
You know, I agree with Dr. Martin entirely. I guess it was the definition of exploitation. As a
right.
behavioral science person, I've been calling it deprivation, right?
Sure.
The extreme deprivation of their rights, of all what that is expected with in child development and human development, and of course the disruption of family processes. That to me is deprivation. But I would agree if we extended the definition of exploitation, Dr. Martin and I would be in full agreement.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of it. They're in a way being exploited for political purposes.
Yes.
And in that sense, all of the deprivation is a form of exploitation.
Indeed.
Thank you, Susan Martin. I think I definitely agree. Exploitation as a term is sometimes difficult to define. So that's something else to think about. My next question is for Rhonda Fleischer. What are the most common ways refugee children have been separated from their families?
Thank you. And I also just want to say thank you again for allowing me to join the panel. So there's a lot of different ways that migrant asylum seeking children have been separated from their families. I'd like to touch on a few of them. I think we all know quite well the zero tolerance policy that really riveted the country and the world because of just how devastating we all know that the impact of child separation, family separation is for children in so many different ways, not to mention their parents. But you know, we also know that family separation happens very proactively in other forms and also sort of indirectly as a result of different policies that have been implemented over the past few years. Some of those include certainly zero tolerance. We've also seen a few hundred children come into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement while their parents were waiting in northern border towns in Mexico under migration protection protocols, a sort of restrictive policy that has forced asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their asylum case proceeds. So parents who sent their children across the border alone, feeling like there was no other choice for their children to find safety. The other way that family separation has played itself out has been with what some advocates call binary choice, with families that have been in ICE family detention centers and court rulings that have held up some protections for children that have required ICE to release children who aren't supposed to be in detention for more than 20 days and sort of leaving, but not their parents, leaving parents in these family detention centers a very difficult choice about whether to sort of release, sort of abdicate their rights under the Flores Agreement for children to be released and remain in detention indefinitely with their children or be separated and have their children be released. And the fourth way that I'd like to mention is the increasingly dangerous conditions in the northern Central America, Mexico, and US sub-region overall, especially not only has that been the result of continuing violence, exploitation, extreme poverty in countries of origin, but also all made worse with very restrictive immigration enforcement policies. And now with the pandemic, border closures have increasingly kept migrant families and in many cases unaccompanied children in very precarious humanitarian situations. And border closures have really exacerbated those risks. So, and I bring that up because I do think it's important to recognize that the migration flows in the sub-region are largely these days have, over the past few years, have consisted of families with children in increasing numbers, and there continue to be large numbers of unaccompanied children. We know that over 90% of unaccompanied children who enter the United States come for all kinds of reasons that are pushing them to seek safety, but also over 90% are seeking reunification with a parent who is in the United States or another immediate family member. So any sort of policies that are reducing legal pathways to those children reunifying with their parents who are in the United States prolongs their separation. So I just want to point out that there are so many different ways this dynamic plays out. And it just very concretely, I think you all probably have, are more aware of the zero tolerance policy, where at least 3,000 children were forcibly separated from their parents at the border. It became official policy in April 2018. It had been happening prior to that, continued even after the president signed an executive order in June halting that practice. And we know as of October that 545 children still had not been reunified with their families. And now with COVID, that reunification has been made even more difficult because of parents who were deported back to Northern Central America and the difficulty of actually locating them. So that being said, there also have been continued discretionary separations that Customs and Border Protection have done since official family separation has been discontinued. Discretionary decisions about separating children because of fears that I shouldn't say fears, because of decisions made that their parents have some type of criminal background that would put their children at risk. The decisions by which, the criteria by which those decisions are made are not clear. And I think the other point I want to make about the discretionary separations that happen at the border really have been going on for quite a long time. And that's really about how the law is set up, that as it is now, a child who is with a parent or another adult who has legal custody for that child remains with that child. But we know that there's all kinds of adult caregivers that arrive at the border with children who have been their caregivers. But as it is right now, the law does not allow for those other adults to remain with those children. And that process, so CBP is supposed to transfer that child to the Office of Refugee Resettlement to do a vetting process and ensure that the child is with a safe adult. So just to say that it's a very complex process, has taken so many different forms. And I think I just, would like to end by just pointing out, I think we all recognize that family unity is absolutely essential to children's well-being. It is, for UNICEF, it is one of our 6 priority asks for migrant children globally. Probably one of the most important determinants for children's well-being is their ability to be protected and cared for by their parents. So this has been a priority for UNICEF in the United States, around the world, and we're eager to keep up the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really illuminating. My next question is for Susan Martin. So going back to the theme of exploitation, how can we approach communicating with local and national governments to ensure more policies and support are put into place for refugees in need to protect them from trafficking?
Right. First of all, I want to just make sure that everyone understands the differences in terminology between refugees and trafficking, because refugees and asylum seekers are people who are fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of certain protected characteristics, their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And the asylum process generally will only afford protection to those who have already been trafficked, and in which their vulnerability or their fear of persecution is based on those trafficking experiences or the reasons that they've been trafficked. On the other hand, trafficking is defined as the movement of people for purposes, either through deception or coercion, but for the specific purpose of exploiting their labor. It can be sex trafficking, or it could be trafficking for labor, for working in various different bad work conditions on that. So to deal with the reduction of trafficking really requires that you're looking at the situations in the places of origin. In the case of a refugee, it might be in a very poor urban area of the place where they've sought initial refuge, or it could be that they are still in their country of origin and are escaping or trying to escape from being trafficked further and having their labor exploited or sex trafficking. So there are a variety of pathways that need to be taken in order to be able to protect the children who are in these situations. If they are refugees, it means making sure that the places in which they have sought refuge are safe for them and provide some economic opportunities. The first exposure I had to trafficking in a refugee camp was in the 1980s on the Thai-Cambodian border. And brothel owners from Bangkok were coming into the camps when aid organizations weren't there, and picking out the girls that they wanted to take, and with collusion with the Thai military, were in fact kidnapping these girls and bringing them back to the brothels. Also, resistance forces were coming in when the aid organizations weren't there, and rounding up young boys and girls to join the resistance, forcibly join it. The girls often, in order to clear mines, they'd walk in front of the soldiers. So if there were mines, they would be harmed by them instead of the soldiers. So these were very, very callous, heinous acts that were being perpetrated. But the refugees were vulnerable because there wasn't sufficient assistance and protection within those camps, and that's the situation for refugees worldwide. So that's the first thing we can do, just improve those conditions for the refugees and give them full protection of the law, these situations. But then there are other things that can be done in terms of training of law enforcement, judicial bodies, health authorities, public health hospitals, things of that sort. People who first come into contact with those who might be vulnerable to being trafficked, and making sure that they understand the warning signs and have the tools and understanding that they need in order to be able to take action that will protect the best interest of the child in those situations. So those are some of the approaches, dealing with the causes of why people are vulnerable, but also trying to deal with with education for those who are most likely to be able to intervene in time. to either protect people from being trafficked or to help those who have been trafficked get to some type of safety. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Would anyone like to add to that? Okay, so my next question is for Dr. Zayas. What ways can we safely get refugees out of their trafficking situations without endangering them any further?
You know, I'm afraid that's out of my scope of expertise. So I'll allow one of my other co-panelists to answer that one. I don't do work in human trafficking.
I apologize for that. We can move on to another question. Well, and anyone who wants to can take this up. What is the legal status and rights given to refugees in the US? What are some policies that are already in place to help refugees entering the United States?
I would like to start out with that one, but focusing more on the asylum seeker, which is what we're encountering primarily at our southern border. And there are laws that protect asylum seekers, and there are lots of policies to protect them and to assist them. However, it has to do with what a particular government administration will do, so that we've seen an erosion of those rights that asylum seekers have coming to the United States in the past 4 years. And even prior to that, there were restrictions on it imposed by the Department of Homeland Security. And so there are the protections. The question is, how are they implemented? And they have not been implemented to the benefit of children and families who are seeking asylum in the United States. So for example, we would assume that a policy would start with some value. That is, we value human life and we want to protect human life. Therefore, set up policies that protect those individuals using those sort of principles and values of how we're going to treat families. But that hasn't been the case, so that when they are taken into custody either by CBP or ICE, they are often put into these 72-hour holding cells that are cold. There's light on for 24 hours, unpleasant conditions, no real chance to bathe and to rest during that time, and conditions that none of us would want to be placed in. After 72 hours, they may be transferred to a detention center where they then assume what would be a normal prison life rather than normal life. So there are policies that are in place, there are laws that are in place, but they have not been followed with the idea of treating people well, humanely, and preparing them and doing what has to be done, which is allow them to get legal representation. Many of the detention centers that I've worked at are remote, are far away from population centers. So that means immigration attorneys have to drive out there. And when they're there, the private prison companies that run the detention centers do everything they can to interrupt the normal course of receiving legal services, or even in my case, when I would go to do evaluations of children and families in order to provide those evaluations to the attorneys representing them. There was always some reason why I could not get in. Most of the fabricated ideas, your name is not on the list, your attorney's not here, things like that. So that, they're intentionally set up to prevent the asylum seeker from getting the application of the laws that protect them. And the same way with respect to the credible hearing interviews, where oftentimes the person that's doing the interview is far away. It's coming through camera or audio, and may not speak Spanish or even the indigenous language. And then it involves a translator. And so there's not really a very good system of protecting the asylum seekers' rights. I'll stop there and have my colleagues join in.
I would add to that if that's okay. I do think just sort of scanning, fully agree. And I think just to kind of pull back to your question about refugees, we know that refugees, the right for people to seek refuge and protection in another country is grounded in the UN Convention, a UN convention that goes back decades following World War II, that recognize the need for people fleeing persecution is something that is a basic human right in essence, and that was codified into law in the United States with the Refugee Act. And just to clarify, refugees, we know that there have been a serious reduction in the number of refugees that have been resettled, welcomed to the United States in the past few years. And yet a small number continue to arrive. They're adjudicated as refugees overseas before arriving to the United States. And I think that what's really important to recognize is that the asylum seekers who largely come from the southwest border, someone who's seeking asylum, ultimately, if they're adjudicated as asylees, they basically should be afforded the same types of protections that refugees are. In fact, the definition of an asylee and a refugee is essentially the same, with the exception that they're given that status within the United States rather than overseas. I think it's important to recognize that there's a whole host of other legal protections that people that are seeking safety or protection in the United States are entitled to, even if they don't meet the formal definition of refugee status or asylum eligibility, even if they cannot get to that particular eligibility under the law. And in the case of children, for example, where UNICEF's position and as reflected in U.S. laws like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and other national laws and other international laws, children deserve and have the right to be protected regardless of their refugee or asylum status. So I think we could probably go on for a while about this, but I just want to make that distinction that there's sort of the rights that people have as refugees, but at the end of the day, when it comes to children, for sure, a child is a child, regardless of their migration status.
Yeah, and if I could add something in on this also, because I think this is a really important question. I think we have a relatively established system for unaccompanied minors. And the Trump administration has done all sorts of things to try to undermine that system. But it is in law and in regulation, and there are possibilities for re-strengthening them. And that's in terms of the Flores settlement, which is the legal settlement where the government has agreed to limit the amount of time that children are in detention and to ensure their release to the least restrictive environment possible. Again, undermined, but still there to be used. On the asylum side, and I'm sorry, before I get to that, the other status that's available for children is the special immigrant juvenile status, which is a status for kids if a U.S. state court has determined that that child has been abandoned or is unable to return to their parents. So they're able to get legal status through that process. There are also T visas, which are for trafficking persons who've been trafficked, and that allows those who have dual claims for both asylum and for and under the trafficking provisions to be able to get legal status. So there are a number of things that work in that respect. But what we really have to do, and that this gets to the fact that there's now an opportunity because President-elect Biden has, in his campaign and his policy positions have said that these are changes he wants to see. We need to revoke the changes that the Trump administration made to the asylum definition in narrowing the possibility for children who are victims of domestic violence or trafficking or drug cartels and gangs getting asylum. We need to reverse the migrant protection protocol so that children and families aren't left in Mexico while awaiting their adjudication. Particularly reverse the provisions under the COVID-19 public health directive that has allowed for direct deportation of asylum seekers without allowing them to avail themselves of the protection of the asylum laws. And we should be reestablishing something that the Obama administration put in place after having handled the 2014 unaccompanied minors and family from Central American situation quite badly in terms of detention. They did establish a program in Central America that allows minors to reunify either as refugees or under the parole authority that the president can exert with their families in the US without having to come here illegally. So those are a few steps. There are many others that need to be taken to improve protection for the children under existing or previously implemented policies in the country.
Thank you all. Those are all great points. To move on to our next question, this is for Rhonda Fleischer. You oversaw the Cultural Orientation Division at the Resettlement Support Center in Africa. My question is, how do policies conflict with culture, and how can we protect people's cultures while implementing policies?
Interesting question. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll hone in on one specific example that I mentioned related to the family separation question. This issue that there's really not a recognition of kinship care when at the border, when Customs and Border Protection is determining familial relationships and making decisions about separating children from a caregiving adult who's not their parent. At this point where decisions are made based on whether can be proven that it's the biological parent, or as I said, there's some type of legal documentation that shows proof that this adult has legal custody or legal guardianship for the child. Short of that, they are separated until with the child going into an OR shelter. I should say all of this predates Title 42, the Public Health Directive that you kindly described, Susan. Things have been quite different since March, but prior to that, children would be separated from an aunt who had been caring for them as if it was his or her own for many, many years. And only maybe weeks, months later, would that child be reunified once that familial relationship could be verified and the vetting process happens. Honestly, it's a tricky one because realistically, there is a trafficking screening that has to happen. There does need to be some effort to make sure that children are with, in a safe situation. That being said, I think we know that for many of these children, and certainly culturally, what does family mean in different familial settings, in different cultural settings? And I think that we can do better in the United States in recognizing that it's not realistic in many cases to expect that Tia Maria is going to have, her full documentation showing her legal authority to care for this child in the way that it's expected. Another way to approach it would be to actually have child welfare authorities at border reception, at the border, who are on call, available, who social workers, child welfare people who are trained to do child sensitive interviewing, to make decisions that truly have the best interests at heart, and to understand what the familial relationship is, and to sort of have at least an initial assessment, an initial screening on the safety of the child in this relationship, one that could recognize those bonds quickly, as early on in the process as possible. And I think that sort of kinship care piece is one that is implemented and is recognized in other countries around the world.
That's a great point you just raised. Thank you. It's time now for us to move on to questions from the audience. There's an interesting question related to the current elections. Anybody who would like to answer, and feel free to just jump in. The question is, with Joe Biden being elected, do you think there will be a change of policy regarding the zero tolerance policy or any other immigration policies?
I'll just answer that very quickly, and then let the other panelists take the rest. Just to be clear, the zero tolerance policy has been discontinued officially. So the way that discretionary separations happen at Customs and Border Protection, in some ways that's going to require some real determination to take that on and really look carefully at the way these decisions are made. It's going to take a real effort, political will, to completely transform the way that we approach reception at the border from a detention model, an immigration enforcement model, to one that is truly a child-sensitive reception system. And I don't think it's a given. While I think that there may be some executive actions that could be overturned, there's a possibility MPP could be overturned, or ultimately that the public health directive could be reversed. I don't think that we can take that for granted. And I think some of the other ways, this whole sort of reorientation of how we approach reception at the border is one that's going to take a lot more voices advocating for change. I don't think that we can assume that it will be that simple. And quite honestly, it isn't that simple. Operationally, there are going to be a lot of things to sort out if we want to change how we do this.
Yeah.
Let me just go ahead, Dr. Martin.
Oh no, go ahead.
Thank you.
You chimed in first.
We can recall that the detention centers that were formed in roughly 2014 were under the Obama-Biden administration. That's when they began. And while it was not the best model that we could have come up with as a country, it certainly was far better than the transformation that has taken place in the past 4 years, in which all of the conditions that Obama and Biden set into place have been grotesquely distorted, where the zero tolerance policy has risen, and we've gotten the separation of children. At the very least, that didn't happen under Obama and Biden. So we would think that a president like Biden would be in a position to at least return to the state where the conditions where they were when he was vice president. And so I think we can hold some hope that that would be the case. I'd like to draw attention to that. We talk about policy in a way that perhaps separates us from the life of a child. And when we think about what these conditions truly are like, we've got to look at the psychological long-term psychological impact on each and every individual child, from the traumas they suffered in their home countries of deprivation and poverty and violence and the loss of life, of family members, through the trek, and then through the trek through Mexico to our borders, and what they experienced there, what they witnessed, what they were subject to, and then the third level of trauma at the border when they were have been mistreated by our government. I think we're going to have to put into place into the future services, attention to these children as they enter the communities that they ultimately go to. So the asylum seeker who is adjudicated and is permitted to enter the United States, at least until they get a hearing at the immigration court. I think we've got to be able to prepare downstream for these services, because the level of trauma that these children have suffered will not evaporate without attention and without services and treatment.
Yeah, let me add a few elements to this. For the Biden administration to change the policies mean that they have to go through several different types of procedures. Many of the Trump policies were adopted through executive action at the presidential level or at the Secretary of Homeland Security level, or the CDC for the COVID-19 requirements. And for the federal government to act on these issues, they have to be consistent with the Administrative Procedures Act, in that they have to go through a full process for getting there. And the Trump administration, fortunately, was very bad at that. They didn't usually go through all the steps that they were supposed to be, and they got sued, and they often lost the suit, or the policies still haven't gotten totally through the judicial process, and they've been on hold since then. So things would have been much worse. But it also means the Biden administration will have to get to a very high level of credibility on their process in order to be able to avoid suits, which are going to happen against any changes that they want to take. There are other things in which the states or others have sued the Obama administration, such as on DACA, and then the Trump administration has weighed in, or they've continued to fight a suit that has been winning in the courts, but the defendants in it are trying to get it up to the Supreme Court. The administration can back out of some of those things and say, no, we agree to the changes that the defendants have asked for, and make the suit moot. And so they can make change in that way. But there are some, and then there are also things where the Attorney General has made a decision on a specific case, which has narrowed the grounds upon which asylum can be granted for, and that means just the new Attorney General reversing those decisions and hoping that that passes judicial muster on it. But fundamentally, the issues that we need to be solving to make the refugee system more consistent, more child protective, have to be done through legislation. And that's going to require a coalition that involves a broad number of advocacy groups and broad number of institutions to be able to get it through the Senate. There's legislation that's been getting through the House, but just never even taken up in the Senate. So that, I think, are the three ways in which we have to be working to reverse some of these policies. And they're not, I agree with my colleagues, they're not going to be easy to reverse, but I think it's important that at least we hold the new administration to task. One last quick point is that if the intelligence coming in at the time of between now and the time of the inauguration demonstrates that reversal of some of these policies will lead to a large surge in people trying to get across the border, that will significantly tie the Biden administration's hands in terms of how quickly they reverse these policies, so as not to precipitate a major crisis within the first few weeks of the administration. And so that's something we have to all be on the lookout for.
Thank you for those insightful responses. I would like to ask one last question before we conclude, as we're nearly out of time. What are the ways we as college students can make an impact on policies to positively affect the lives of refugees? The question is open to anyone who would like to respond.
Well, you know, your voices, your vote, your advocacy is really what's going to help change the landscape. Now, Dr. Martin just mentioned, you know, what it takes with respect to changing laws. It is about the movements or the activities of individuals like you and me to speak to our local representatives, our state and federal representatives, and influence them. I think what we need to do also is each of us has an area of expertise, and we need to take that expertise and apply it to this important situation of our time. And I think that's really what students need to do. Write, do research, get that information there, testify in immigration courts, testify before federal and state bodies, any way that you can get your voices and present unassailable arguments to those who make the decisions.
Yeah, let me add to that. I agree completely with everything that's just been said. But one other thing is that it's at Georgetown University, we have an excellent program in which students mentor more recently arrived immigrants, many of whom are coming from Central America and are asylum seekers or here because of the conditions there. And that mentoring program has been really important to the new arrivals, both for the help in the educational side of things, the tutoring that they get, but also for knowing that there are people and people not all that much older than they are who really care about them, care about their futures, and are able to represent their voices and find opportunities for the kids to speak themselves about what their needs are and help be an intermediary. And I really recommend this type of program because it has so many benefits for the kids who are being mentored, but also for our students because they learn so much from the families that and it involves home visits very often. So they end up helping the grandmother figure out how to do something that she doesn't know how to do, relieve the mother to go shopping and things of that sort. So it has huge, huge benefits to everyone.
And I guess I would just add to that. I really like how you all put it, the sort of the larger voice, the voices and all the different ways that we can contribute, as well as the ways to really connect at a human level and support refugees who are arriving in our country. But also very concretely, UNICEF's work for migrant and refugee children in along the northern Central America, Mexico, US migratory route is very much a collaboration between UNICEF and UNICEF USA. And I would encourage everybody to stay connected with UNICEF USA's advocacy in this area. It's an emerging priority for us. It's been a priority. And if you become involved with those efforts, we have grassroots activations that are happening. We're trying to bring to light specific policies that you can weigh in on, different ways to actually engage with your representatives in office, speak out, send a letter or a text to Immigration Customs Enforcement. And of course, we know that the situation in the region is just getting worse. There's been a hurricane, that has completely wreaked havoc on Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua, the migration flows will absolutely continue because there is only so much this region can take. So we also need to provide help to people so that they can have a safe, nurturing life in the place where they call home. So I would just encourage everyone to get involved with UNICEF USA's work, and I think there's so many different ways that we can help and feel very fulfilled and rewarded for doing so. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. This has been extremely illuminating, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.